Let's bring in our panel of journalists now. Susan Delacourt is a columnist with the Toronto Star. Joël Denis Bellavance is the Parliamentary Bureau Chief for La Presse. And Niigaan Sinclair is an assistant professor at the University of Manitoba and a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Good to see you all. Niigaan, if I can, let me start with you. The historic meetings this week between Pope Francis and survivors of residential schools, a lot of emphasis has been placed on the demands for an apology from the Pope to be delivered in Canada at some point, we think. How do you view the importance of the meetings with the Pope and the prospects of an apology in the context of this long, painful, and ongoing process?
Well, the Catholic Church has been resisting this move for quite a long period of time. Back in 2009, the then Pope Benedict, I believe, gave a statement of sorrow to Phil Fontaine, the Assembly of First Nations delegation at that time. A very private meeting, small statement that was issued without much fanfare. And since that time, of course, we've heard about the unmarked graves, the fact the Canadian Catholic Church has just outright refused to pay their legally mandated compensation under the settlement agreement. And then, of course, all the other issues involving the Catholic Church, continuing missionizations in Indigenous communities and so on. And so this is an effort both to create that healing after a long deal of public pressure, including the very Prime Minister, which asked the Pope to do this and to fulfill Call to Action 58 in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But then this is also a sign that the Church is aware that Catholics in Canada, everyday Catholics, all Catholics in Canada, have really justifiably lost faith in the Church. And this is a move not just to engage Indigenous peoples, but it's also a move to engage Canadian Catholics in what is just an egregious, outrageous decision to resist this move for years and years, and for Catholics to not take responsibility on this. Even the Canadian Catholic bishops have apologized, but the Pope has refused to.
Right. Susan, what do you think this week in Rome means in that process of reconciliation?
I was really struck by the tone, especially Niigaan Obed talking today about just the friendliness, the fact that gifts were exchanged, that I think the delegation was quite taken with the Pope's interest and knowledge of who they were. So, as Niigaan is saying, this is a long way from where things were even a couple of years ago. And I do think, as Niigaan also says, this has something to do with the fact that the anger or the outrage has been building up from here. I don't think even a few years ago you would have heard a minister calling the Catholic Church and the Pope shameful, as Mark Miller did last year, for not apologizing, or the Prime Minister, everybody from the Prime Minister on down in his government saying to Canadian Catholics, pressure your church. So I do think this is an evolution, it's an important one, and it was an important day.
Joël, let me hear from you. What we heard spoke to him earlier on the program from the delegations that there was no commitment from the Pope, for an apology. Did a lot of listening. So there's still some uncertainty about whether they'll actually live up, and the Pope will live up to the demands being asked of him by Indigenous people and clearly others in this country. So where do you think we are in this process after what we're seeing this week in Rome?
Well, I would expect that the delegation that is currently in Rome might be successful where politicians have failed in the past. Mr. Trudeau sent Marco Mendicino, when he was a regular MP in Rome, to try to convince the Pope to apologize for what happened under the Church watch to young Tuckton. So it might bring closer scrutiny to the actions of the Church, because there is a delegation of descendants of original people. But also, I would point out, Peter, that the fact that the discovery of unknown unmarked graves last year, I think, brought international attention to this issue and probably increased pressure very much on the Church to do something, to bring some closure, some sort of closure to the awful years and awful actions that were committed.
Some people, Niigaan, suggest the apology moves us well down the road, maybe even towards, clearly more healing, but towards a possible conclusion. But Is that really the case, or does the apology really mark the beginning of what's then expected of the Catholic Church?
Not even close. Not even close. So here's the issues that, and I've been tweeting about this all day, and I've also read a column about this. Here's the four main issues. You have to have the Canadian Catholic Church compensate up to $60 million that they owe to survivors, legally compensated, legally mandated for that compensation. They have yet to pay that. Every other church has paid that ran the schools except for the Catholic Church. The stolen land to run the schools, the fact that land needs to be returned. The materials, including documents and stolen materials and archives that need to be returned or at least made publicly available. And then finally, there needs to be a international inquest independent of the church to investigate why there is such rampant sexual, mental, physical abuse in the church that is ongoing today. And that's what survivors are interested most. And then we can begin to discuss the issue and use the R word, which people haven't used very much. Notice it hasn't left the words of many Indigenous peoples, reconciliation, because an apology does very little. In fact, the popes have done everything but this in the past, to say sorry, to say I have a statement of sorrow, whatever it might be. But coming to Canada, it will be a good step to meet with Indigenous communities and to utter those words.
Okay, we'll have more to talk about this week. I'm sure this story will be with us all this week in terms of the spotlight on Rome, but because the story beyond Rome is not going away either. But Susan, let me pivot the conversation here to childcare and the deal reached with Ontario today, the last province to sign on. But now the Prime Minister has a signature program that all provinces have bought into, federal money in exchange for federal objectives in an area of provincial jurisdiction. Do you think this sets the table for the kind of healthcare discussion we're going to see when it gets down to the deep talks about increasing health transfers to the provinces?
It's a really interesting point, Peter. Yes, it probably is a template. I've been struck just in the last week for how much we are now talking in Canada about expanding the social safety net. Whether it was last week we were talking about dental care, pharmacare, and child care, all of those things that are going to be very hard for a future government to roll back, deliberately so. I think for the benefit of people back home watching this, if you're keeping score, Doug Ford was kinder and more effusive about his relationship with the federal Liberals than Jagmeet Singh was last week. So I'm left wondering, where's the real coalition here? There is certainly... I never thought I'd see a day where a Conservative premier was talking about expanding the social safety net with a Liberal Prime Minister, unless you're thinking way back to the days of Bill Davis and Pierre Trudeau.
Joël Denis, what do you think is happening here? And is this the precursor to, as I suggest, this notion of, look, give Canadians something they absolutely want, that premiers will have trouble saying no to, put some federal money behind it, and then you can set whatever conditions you want at some point?
Well, that's also a very good point, but I would say that if Mr. Trudeau wants to follow that template, he will have to put a lot of money on the table. It's not going to be, I think, a minimum of $10 billion in increase per year to be able to attract the support of some provinces. In fact, the Council of Federation that assembles all the province premiers, they demand $26 billion increase yearly. So for Ottawa to be able to successfully negotiate with each province separately, there will need to be a lot of money. But I would say that this was the template that was followed also when the Liberal government early in its mandate decided to limit the increase of healthcare transfers to provinces. They put some money on the table, and some provinces went along with it, including first New Brunswick, and then other provinces followed suit, and Ottawa concluded a deal with everybody. But I want to go back to what Susan said. This is a huge moment in Canadian history in the sense that we are enlarging the social safety net in a very big way, and it's going to be hard for future governments, I think, to demolish or unravel this because such a big deals with a lot of money involved.
Niigaan, let me get a final comment from you on this.
Yeah, with all this talk of coalitions and positivity and friendship, let's all just remember that we're not talking about Doug Ford's disastrous record during the pandemic. And that was what was been dominating the Doug Ford legacy for months and months, years. And now here we are talking about Doug Ford getting a childcare deal done. This is all about Doug Ford's re-election campaign. And while I don't want to perhaps tinge the positive outlook that we're taking when we're talking about this is undoubtedly about Trudeau's legacy. This is undoubtedly a good thing for all working families. But This is also about Doug Ford trying to change a conversation with just weeks before heading into a provincial election where he was down in the polls for weeks and weeks and weeks and has had this thunderous return to forerunner status in the Ontario provincial election.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thank you all for your time tonight. Great to talk to you, and we'll talk again soon. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.